All right, so I'd like to turn it over to Devesh, who is on the CRA industry steering committee, to tell us a little bit about CRA-I. So Devesh.
Thank you. So I'll just start with this slide by mentioning that, probably most of you, who are attendees here know about the Computing Research Association, but it's an organization that's been around for over 50 years now, with the goal of uniting industry, academia, and government to advance computing research. And it's a North American organization with has many committees, and CRA Industry is the most recent committee, about 3 years old. If you can move to the next slide. And CRA Industry's mission is, within industry focus is to convene industry partners on computing research topics of interest to the community as a whole, connect them with constituents, right, academia and government, for mutual benefits. Now, the industry that we are thinking about covers industry of all types, traditional computing research, as well as things in, industry in other areas, big organizations, startups, small organizations across the whole thing. And over the last 3 years, what we have been doing is we have been convening our members, convening the industry participants to share perspectives and try and sort of see what are the emerging topics that would be of interest to everybody. And this today's roundtable is an example of something that emerged from that. And what we've been doing is we've been, having interviewing stakeholders, often, stakeholders meeting with the CRA Industry Steering Committee and the Council, following which we sort of convened roundtables, which are small gatherings of this kind, which, somewhere between 3 to 5 participants, 3 to 5 panelists, and inviting attendees to listen. And, following these roundtables, we have often found that having a day-and-a-half long workshops on various topics have been of great value. So I invite you to go to the CRA Industry website and see what are all the roundtables we have organized, what are the workshops we have organized. And so now I'll turn the floor, mic back to Elizabeth, who will lead us through the rest of the agenda for today.
All right, thank you, Devesh. Next slide. So you can go ahead and click through the slide here. So just a little bit of background. Artificial intelligence, or AI, has been around for decades. Some of us probably remember the different AI winters that we've been through as interest and funding into AI has gone up and down. The field has evolved considerably over the last several decades, and in particular over the last couple of years, we're going to focus on an area called generative AI. I asked ChatGPT to give me a good definition for this. And AI, so at the high level, AI is the broad field of creating machines that perform tasks requiring human intelligence. Generative AI is a subset of AI that generates new content, like text, large language models, images, by learning data patterns. Generative AI is significant because it automates creative processes, and it has applications across every sector. So in essence, AI mimics human intelligence, while generative AI creates new original content, expanding AI's potential. So we are here because we are excited about generative AI. In particular, we are excited about its potential to accelerate discovery, research, and innovation across every field. So I think next slide. Go to the next slide. All right, so ChatGPT was first released to the public by OpenAI on November 30th, 2022. And since then, we have seen an amazing adoption of ChatGPT. This rapid adoption really made generative AI accessible to the public. And we have seen a lot of estimates around what generative AI is going to be able to do and an impact on the workforce. Here's just a couple of headlines over the last year about how many jobs will be impacted, changes to jobs and the tasks in specific jobs. And of course, we've all probably heard the impact on programming in particular, that programmers, I think the latest one I heard was that programmers are going to spend at least 50% less time coding. Next slide. So here I have a few headlines in the research and science fields. So these are just a collection of areas. You'll see a lot of really exciting announcements around protein design and development, material science, medicine, engineering. A lot of them claiming to take things that used to have taken months or years to do is now a couple of days or weeks. So the ability to accelerate the pace of discovery is remarkable. And we'll hear about some of these examples today. So next slide. So in addition to the science itself, we see generative AI and opportunities for generative AI to help researchers themselves in writing manuscripts, writing grant applications, doing literature reviews, surveys of the field. So I think there are a number of ways. This is actually a paper from Nature that surveyed 1,600 researchers to get impressions on how they were using GenAI today and where they think it could make a big difference. So with that, I would like to go to the next slide, and I would like to introduce our, well, before I do that, I'll just recap the goals for our roundtable today. We're going to discuss some examples of how generative AI is being used. We're going to talk about the impact on scientific discovery in the R&D community, and we're going to discuss how, as a community, we can ensure the responsible use and development. And with that, I would like to introduce our amazing panel today. And what I'm going to do is ask each of you to introduce yourself, say where you are, and a little bit about what you do. You have about a minute each. So Travis, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm Travis Johnson. I'm the Director of Bioinformatics at the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute. And what we do is we support all the researchers there at the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute. And we really just do a lot of large-scale multi-omic studies. And we try to basically identify new novel drug targets. And we also do some deep learning methods development kind of in line to identify new novel drug targets.
Fantastic. Thank you, Travis. All right, I'll turn it over to Jing Liu, to introduce yourself.
All right. My name is Jing Liu. I am the Executive Director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science at the University of Michigan. So my institute is a campus-wide research institute that enables the use of data science and AI methods for scientific and societal impact. So through research, training, and collaboration. Specifically for AI and generative AI, we focus on enabling the use of such methods broadly in research, the responsible and ethical use of such methods, and also building collaboration across academia, industry, and government.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jing. Vijay, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Vijay Murugesan. I'm a staff scientist in Pacific Northwest National Lab. It's a DOE lab. I'm also a material scientist. I'm a group leader for material sciences research group in PNNL. So I am basically an experimental material scientist with using AI more. And my research is mainly focused on the battery energy storage materials. But my group in general is work on multiple materials project, all the way from peptide-based biomolecules, biomaterials, to metals and metal alloys for high-strength alloy manufacturing. So wide variety of material research and the staff scientist in PNNL.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vijay. And Neil, over to you.
So I'm Neil Thompson. I'm the director of the MIT Future Tech Lab at MIT. We're a lab that is jointly between the Computer Science and AI Lab and the Sloan School of Management. And my group is about half economists and half computer scientists. And we think about the trajectory for AI and more broadly IT, and what that's going to mean for the economy, what that's going to mean for the development of the technology, and what that's going to mean for science.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you all. And What I'm going to do is start with an open question, which I would like each of you to answer. So take maybe 3 or 4 minutes each to answer this, and then I'll do more directed questions for each of you. And apologies that my video is not working, but okay, so first question. Generative AI is here. We are seeing some of these amazing use cases and experiments across different disciplines. And I wanted to ask each of you to just say a few words about where you see the opportunities for the biggest advances when it comes to research in science. So, Travis, I will start with you.
All right, thank you. So I think I have 2 areas that I'm really excited about. One of them is directly applicable to basically what I work in, and that is basically drug discovery. So I don't directly work with molecule prediction, but generative AI really has kind of worked wonders with basically generating new molecules based on the data that we have on old molecules and how they behave in relation to different proteins. So there's actually even some software platforms that are already available, which I'll talk about a little bit later in my section later on. But I think that there's actually a lot of promise there. But more generally, I think that there's a lot of promise also, and you already hit on this, in the software development field. So I just think that people are going to develop software much more quickly with generative AI. Just when I'm writing code, there's many lines of code that you get halfway through that line of code, you don't actually need to finish it. That line of code could like a for loop doesn't necessarily need you to finish it. So I think that having that speed up for programmers and professional developers, that's going to really change the industry. So those are kind of the 2 areas that I'm particularly excited about. And both of those areas, I think, are going to actually be fairly synergistic. The computational chemists that are developing these molecules and using the generative AI to hypothesize new molecules and how they behave, they're also going to obviously benefit from these, for instance, like GitHub Copilot.
Right.
So I think that these are both, the 2 areas that I'm especially interested in.
Fantastic. Thanks, Travis. Okay, Jing, over to you. Biggest advances.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things that are more domain agnostic. I think, and also I want to make sure to say upfront that generative AI has a lot of potential, in everybody's mind, but some of the potentials are not realized yet. But given how fast the technology evolves, I think it's gonna change very, very soon. And then so the 2 things I want to talk about, one is one concerns the sort of the scale of research. How much data, how much more data can generative AI help us grasp? How many more research discoveries that we can grasp with the help of with the help of generative AI, and interdisciplinary research, how that benefits from the team gaining more knowledge across many disciplines that's relevant to them. So I think in terms of handling information, generative AI can help us really make the research more interdisciplinary and make the research larger in scale. That's one thing. And another thing that is also domain agnostic is I really, really hope that generative AI can actually help us figure out what is good science and help us weed out bad science. We talk about, how we trust, right? How AI, how we trust the research that's done by AI. But, if we can use generative AI in a way, right, to identify research that's inconsistent with others, right? And then help us decide what are truly novel discoveries that's worth exploring, what are some just bad results and should be disregarded. I think that could be really useful too.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, what is good science? So that's great. Thank you, Jing. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Vijay.
Thank you. I think for me, the two big things are materials discovery, because there is millions and millions of possible material that could be made. But so far, we've been doing trial and error. So we just come up with some idea or hypothesis, then we go and test. So, but imagine that in generative AI, if I go and say that I want a material, this particular property for this application, and then generative AI telling me that try this material and that. So that will be an amazing thing, because it just makes the discovery so much accelerated, rather than me going back to literature and read a lot of literature, and then no matter how much time I spend, I would never able to cover the entire material science literatures. That's just not possible.
Yeah.
So the best way for is that imagine that the generative AI has the data of all the material researchers, and then it can able to suggest me what the next material is, what could be the best property that material can provide. That will be a big game changer. I think the industry is moving towards that part of it. For example, like a material genome project is a good example of that one, right? Developing a big database of all the materials and bringing into one platform so that we can have a more robust predicting of new materials and properties.
Yep. Fantastic. Thank you, Vijay. And Neil, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to start by answering this question a little bit like an economist. And by that, I mean that one of the really interesting things about the way scientists use computers is that they sort of, they use them, but they use them in very different ways, right? So you have some people who use sort of the computer on their desktop, and they're often taking advantage of that, but they don't really sort of want to scale up even more than that. And you have people at the very other extreme who are doing like supercomputing simulations, right? And they're also using a lot, but in both cases, you can get to a situation where the marginal value of that next bit of computing. So if you said like, hey, how valuable would it be to give you an extra computer, is not that valuable. And I think what generative AI and AI in more broadly has allowed us to do is to make scientists more productive by allowing them to leverage more computing, right? And so from the point of view of an economist, the long history of sort of us becoming more productive as a species is a lot about us figuring out how to master new tools and having them be very valuable. And I think this is really a very nice example of allowing a whole bunch of scientists to leverage their computation more directly. And I would give two specific examples of that. So Travis already brought up coding. I think that's really, really important because lots of areas of science, people don't really want to become expert coders themselves, right? But having good, efficient code and being able to write it quickly is very valuable to them. So that I think just as an everyday tool that makes them better will be great. The other thing I'm quite excited about is this pathway not only of sort of discovery, but learning from it. And here's what I mean by that. So Vijay already brought up this idea that you can use generative AI to come up with new hypotheses about something that might be good, right? And I think in the short run, that's going to be very, very valuable because there are probably some low-hanging fruit we've just missed as scientists, and being able to actually grab those will be great. But over the longer term, what I'm excited about is that, and I've already seen talking to scientists who are doing this, where what they'll do is they'll say, well, maybe we have some system we don't understand very well, but when we use a deep learning system, we can actually model it. We can model it quite well. So we don't know why it's doing what it's doing, but we can predict it very well. But then what you can do is use that to generate oodles of data about it. You can use your predictive model to generate oodles of data about it in a way that you often can't in the physical world. Like you just can't afford to run that many experiments or gather that much data. And so then you can treat it as like a data science problem, where you say, now I have a whole bunch of data and I'm trying to learn the underlying truth about it. And it's a way for us to use these models, which are often inscrutable themselves, to nevertheless predict some pattern in the world, learn it as a data scientist, and then gain our understanding. And I think for the overall progress of science more broadly, I think that's a very important development, and I'm very excited about it.
That's great. I love all the different viewpoints. So thank you all. So that was our first open question. I am now going to be more targeted, and I have a few directed questions for each of our panelists. And Vijay, I'm going to start with you over at the Pacific Northwest National Labs. I saw a paper recently about how you sped up from, it sounds like, years of research to weeks, the development of a new battery material, which is very exciting. And I was just curious if you could just tell us a little bit more about this process. Like, how is it actually accelerating the way that you go through and identify particular materials?
Yes, it's a collaborative project between Pacific Northwest National Lab and Microsoft. So Microsoft had the Azure Quantum Elements platform. So they used that platform to design a new battery material. So what they did is that they built 32 million new materials. And then they put a screening parameter. So basically that you need to have this particular property, these set of properties to be a good battery material. And then they screen it down and down. For example, like out of 32 million, they reduce it to 500,000 by looking at the phase stability, structural and chemical stability, and then down to few thousand by looking at the electrochemical stability, which is important parameter for that. And then based on the conductivity and other properties, they down selected into about 100 or so. And then they, domain experts like us, we go in and then we look at the materials, and we said some of the materials are kind of known. That's a good thing because the AI predicted materials, which we know that it works. So that gives us a confidence in the model that it's generating a valuable data. So then we go and look at it, and then we added a few more extra screenings, basically like how much this material is going to cost. Is it going to be, is it viable in terms of large scale productions and so on? So we do all those things, and we finally come up to a handful of materials that we down selected. And then we go to the lab and we actually synthesize that one of the material, and then we actually tested it and showed it as a viable battery on that. So that was the work on that. But now if you can imagine that from this 32 million to handful of material, the 100 so material, that happened in 80 hours, right? So from 32 million down to about 100 or so happened in 80 hours. That's the acceleration that we are very excited about. The actual experimental still takes some time, but instead of me thinking about the material, reading on hundreds and thousands of literatures, come up with a new material, what this provided me is that here is the list of material that we think is going to be a potential application. And can we go straight to the lab and start making those materials and validating those models? So that's what the acceleration means, right? Spending a lot of researchers, spending a lot of time on the literatures and reading and discussing and whether this material or that material. The hypothesis-driven research is now become, the hypothesis coming from the AI and giving that material, it just accelerates so fast that the material discovery process becomes so faster.
Yep. So you go from like, you're now able to survey an entirely much larger number of possible examples in a much faster amount of time. I don't know, you said 80 hours. I'm assuming normally to survey 32 million possible material, they would have taken you a while.
That's not even possible for humans.
It would have been impossible. Okay. So that's pretty profound. And then you are able to then focus on a very narrow set that AI was able to recommend as these are the plausible materials. And then you can go through different things like ability to manufacture and other things that will make it more viable to come out with. Yeah. So taking a step back, like, do you feel like generative AI is really fundamentally changing the way you approach your research? Like, sounds like things are like, how are you, or are you seeing it just change the way you think about research and the scientific method?
It does. The recent example that our collaboration with Microsoft is a good example of that, right? When I saw that 100 or so material, some material, I was like, wow, I never thought about that. I never saw this type of material. If you look at the material science field, it's too broad, and there are many specific regions, like, topic areas, so to speak. Like there are battery research, there's catalysis, there's microelectronics, semiconductors, so many different fields in there. Nobody is expert in all of them, right? I mean, so we kind of focus on the literature on the battery research, and we never thought about going out of the box and think about what the other fields are doing. Is there some material, some of them they are studying could be useful for us, and we never able to do that, or at least not able to do that more efficiently. So what the generative AI type material is doing is that it takes into account of all possible materials, not only on your field, but on all possible material. And then it comes in. Some of the material just surprised me outright. It was like, wow, really? Wow, okay, I never thought about it, or at least that that anybody I know of could have thought about this. So that is that's the factor that excites me, right? It's able to think more broadly and suggest materials which typically we are not trained to come up with, because we are kind of focused on one particular application, and we kind of live in that space, so to speak. So it just broadened my mind.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So if you think ahead a little bit, like let's say in the next, AI time is accelerated, so maybe we'll just say 5 years. But when you think about, I guess, GenAI enabled material science, or I heard even in that article this phrase generative materials. Like, what does this mean?
So it means that we are okay. So there's multiple steps on that. So first step obviously is the materials discovery, right? I mean, material discovery is much more targeted discovery. For example, like I want material to be used in battery or any particular application, right? Then you tell that, okay, for that I need this particular property and things. So it predicts the it predicts a material and then predicts the property of that material and gives a suggestion. What I see that the field is going is that it has to go even beyond that. Basically, if you look back, no material, all devices needs more than one material, right? A single material is not a device. So quite often it has to be coupled with another material. So it's not only, so we need to predict not only the property of that intrinsic property of that material, but rather we need to predict how that material will react or interact with the next material or materials in combination, right? So it's becoming much more complex problem, because we are not predicting only the property, but we are also asking to predict the emerging property, so that we can have a much bigger holistic prediction on that. I see that as more like evolving into kind of a digital twin. So think of this as like, I want to build a battery. Battery has three main components: 2 electrodes, cathode, anode, and then electrolyte. Can able to predict all 3 of them together in synergistic or co-designing way, because each of them has to be compatible with each other and then work synergistically to make the device more performing very well. So the designing, the material discovery has to go beyond the single material discovery, but rather for a device, these are the materials because these are compatible with each other and they can work very efficiently with each other. And that's where we need to go. The second aspect is that there's one part in predicting the material, but we need to go and make that material. Even in our project, the bottleneck was that I had to go back and once the Microsoft, the generative AI give materials, we need to go back and say, how do I going to synthesize this material, right? It's new, okay. How do I going to synthesize? I don't have a recipe. So we had to go and do the literature survey to find out, oh, maybe we can try this method, that method. And that took some time. So the next part of the generative AI I would like to see is that this is a material and this is the synthesis recipe. You can do this and this and this, and then that way you can get a material. So both this material discovery, also giving a way to synthesis recipe, so to speak, and also giving a much bigger holistic view of digital twin in terms of how does this material will interact or perform in a whole device
in a system. Yeah. That's fantastic. Thank you for laying out that vision. Very exciting for material scientists. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Jing for another perspective. Jing is at the University of Michigan, where University of Michigan decided last fall to make generative AI tools, including OpenAI, available to everybody on campus, including faculty, researchers, staff, and students, and really democratizing access to these tools. So Jing, I'm just curious to get a perspective on what you're seeing in terms of adoption. I'm sure there's a lot of experimentation going on, and where you're seeing, some examples of experiments in research that you think are pretty cool.
Okay, so yeah, so there has been a lot of enthusiasm because I think the main reason is really it took away a lot of people's concerns about data privacy. And so I don't have actual data in terms of, to quantify the adoption and experimentation. But, what I hear and what I observe is that there was a lot of adoption. Students, faculty, researchers in both research and teaching and learning. So I also know a lot of researchers and also some departments have been using their own data to augment the model. And then so I think this actually is should be a major use of the model. And so I think this really is kind of, serving its purpose. I also want to mention a couple of things, which is the adoption, I don't think is as wide or as fast as, a lot of people were expecting. But I think that's actually common for all kinds of large language models used for, productivity and daily work, because a lot of people are still not sure, how they can use it and when they can use it, and, and how to assess the output. And before these are resolved, I think a lot of people are still hesitant to try either the U of M GPT or any GPT out there in general. You're asking me about specific research outcomes. I actually don't have very good examples because again, we only rolled out the UM-GPT a few months ago, so I think it's probably too short. And also remember, this is only a large language model, like the ChatGPT, right? So a lot of the things like drug design or protein structure, that's those are generative models in the totally different sense, and so so that doesn't apply to UM-GPT. So
Yep.
Yeah, does this make sense?
Yep, absolutely. In terms of rolling out, in the experience you've had at University of Michigan, do you have advice for other organizations or institutions that may be thinking about doing something similar?
Yeah, I have recommendations for other university and research organizations, but also for University of Michigan and also for my own institute. Because I think we really should play a very different role for generative AI than for previous technologies, exactly because generative AI and AI more broadly have such massive impact and have very different characteristics than I would say the previous technologies. For example, right, when high performance computing comes, right, not every researcher needs it, okay? And but for those who need it, the bottleneck is really how big the operation is to make it available at an organization and the high cost of running HPC. So a university would focus on setting up an HPC facility and finding resources for the small percentage of their researchers who will use it. But generative AI is different because it's instantly available to all researchers at a university. So the challenge the researchers face is not accessibility in many cases. It's about how and when to use it to really maximize its benefits. So traditionally, this is left to the researchers themselves. They need to figure out when they want to use a new technology, they find ways to build skills, right, to use the new technology. But for generative AI, if you leave it to individual researchers to figure out how to use it, the vast majority of them will never keep up with the pace of generative AI advancement. So I want to actually advocate for research organizations and universities to develop new capacity and new approaches to help researchers adopt AI much faster at a much bigger scale, and also help the best domain scientists, the best biologists, the best engineers, the best, material scientists, so that they can be the early adopters of AI. And so I also want to mention that over the past decade or so, when the AI technology has already been moving very fast, many people have expressed the kind of sentiment that, the traditional model of scientific research and academic research is far behind technology advancement. I recently even heard one prominent scientist say that science needs to be reborn. I think generative AI is making this point really clear. So I think, one of the fundamental issues that we also need to think about is really how the model of academic research should evolve to best leverage new technologies such as generative AI.
That's a really interesting point, and especially given that you are sitting in the data science institute, because we've just seen, this wave of big data and data science, and now generative AI. These technologies are coming perhaps faster, and yeah, so that is a very interesting perspective. So you said we need to maybe rethink how institutions are helping researchers adopt these new technologies. Is there one or two things is it training? Is it, are there one or two things that really come to top of mind?
So I can think of two things. One is training. And I think a lot of places are doing this. For example, us at my institute, we've been offering hands-on tutorials on how to use generative AI in various specific tasks like writing, coding, data analysis, and all those. We've been doing this for like almost a year now. And so training is definitely a component. But another component, I think, is also about making the generative AI tools I would say more suited for research, for various specific research purposes, and putting those directly in the hands of the researchers.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you another question, just given where you sit, sort of looking institutionally. We've mentioned responsible AI and ensuring the responsible development of technologies. I think that's really important. Do you have anything to sort of, how should we be thinking about addressing responsible AI when it comes to researchers and the research community?
I think this is a really, really important and also really difficult topic. We have been talking about responsible research for decades now, ethical use of data, reproducible research, and so forth, right? But the problems are still there. We still see bad research, wrong results, and being published and being used to support new research, right? We still see these things around. And I think with the rush of getting generative AI to be embedded in research, I think things will get worse before it gets better. There's so many generative AI models that people use are closed source, right? So we don't know what goes on in there. And even for open sourced models, right, the users aren't necessarily skilled enough to understand and to inspect these models, right? And so how do we trust the outcomes, right? And then there are also systemic issues, such as the pressure to publish in academia. For example, if one of your competitors, right, suddenly is publishing 40 papers a year instead of 10 because they're using generative AI. Well, what are you going to do? Right? You're going to jump in.
Publish 80 papers. Yes.
Right. Right. And then so, also like, there aren't a lot of uniform guidelines out there or ways to teach researchers how to use AI responsibly. So I am worried about the validity of research outputs in the near future. But on the other hand, I think, if generative AI can sort of exaggerate these issues of responsible research and make them really obvious, right? Then I think more people will actually take action, right? To rethink about what we really value in science, right? When AI makes so many of the routine things easy and faster, right? What should we do? What should be our real contribution to science? And I think these sort of, and then, sort of what kind of discovery process should we, look into in the future? And so how do we develop more thoughtful attitudes and approaches toward, responsible research? So I think, even right now, we can't really think of many new ideas other than, guidelines, training, enforcement, and those things. But I think we might actually be forced to rethink a lot of fundamental issues in science, which I think is going to be great.
Well, yeah, exciting. And it goes back to your original, kind of the biggest opportunities for Gen AI around determining what is good science and building and ensuring trust in science. So I think that's really important. And as a research community, I think it's something we should be talking about across, like, broadly. Okay, I am gonna thank you, Jing. I am gonna turn over to Travis. We're gonna get back into a little bit of some of the examples of how we're using Gen AI in science today around the biosciences. So Travis, your research institute is using AI to learn from masses of big data to do really important things like treat patients with diseases like Alzheimer's and patients that have obesity. It helps us understand the disease better and also potential drug treatments better. So can you tell us maybe an example or just tell us kind of how you're using Gen AI today?
So I actually have a couple of different examples, and I think I just want to kind of put them into like two different categories. There's more of like, the research category where, we're using Gen AI algorithms for research purposes. And then there's more to like DJ's point, there's more of like an efficiency category. And I mean, these aren't like mutually exclusive by any means. But one example that I wanted to highlight, and it also kind of highlights the fact that our students are early adopters of a lot of these technologies, kind of like what Jing's saying. One of my students actually found this algorithm. It's called TXYZ, and effectively it's a large language model, and it's a generative AI, and you can, if you don't want to, you don't have to upload a paper, but you can. And when you upload your paper, it fine-tunes this model on your paper, and then it prompts you to ask questions about that paper, that scientific publication. So it can kind of speed up your hypothesis generating process, and like reading papers. So you can basically speed up generating the hypotheses to actually find new targets for these clinicians that we're working with and these wet lab researchers, just by using these generative AI tools that are, either low cost or sometimes even no cost. So TXYZ, that one actually has a free version online. And I mean, I just, kind of looked, I had no idea about this. And I just looked over his shoulder one day and, asked him, what he was doing. And it's literally, he's, asking this Gen AI questions about this paper he had uploaded. And it actually seemed to be giving him, very reasonable, answers.
So I was just Travis, I was just going to say, someone showed me how they used Copilot to generate their entire outline of their PhD thesis. So I'm thinking, based on what you said, doing the literature review and then doing the hypothesis, narrowing your hypothesis based on current literature and then drafting your whole PhD outline. PhDs may be accelerating as well.
Yep. And yeah, it's really pretty amazing. And, I'm not going to harp too much on the, writing code segment of this either, but some of our bioinformaticians, we don't use GitHub Copilot, but we've looked into it.
Yep.
Some of our bioinformaticians use ChatGPT-4, especially if they don't know, especially if they haven't implemented something before, they might just get a rough draft from ChatGPT-4 for a script. And, that, dramatically increases, their efficiency writing code. In terms of research, I think GenAI has a lot of really interesting things that, can help us out to just really speed up drug discovery. So obviously, it's going to make us work more quickly in practice, but it can also, help us, answer, new questions. So some of the things that, I'm personally interested in would be basically generating new types of data that, may not be available. So this is, kind of a bit like Neil's point here. You might not have all of the data that you want, right? So if you could, you might be able, if you have the right staff and you have the right expertise, you could actually just build a generative AI to actually generate the data that you want. So, I mean, there's already quite a few models that have been built in the last 5 years, for instance, to predict, cancer drug sensitivity. So there's like variational autoencoders and generative adversarial networks. And now there's even models, for instance, like generative adversarial networks to generate single cell RNA sequencing data. I think that there's a lot of opportunities here where you could start to generate data where maybe you don't have single cell data for drug response, but you could use a generative AI to at least get a rough draft of that data before you actually go into the lab and generate it yourself.
Yeah.
So that's another area that I think is really promising for generative AI. And the last area in terms of research is just generating new molecules. So obviously the IBRI, the main goal is to develop new drugs. And there's been a lot of work recently in generative AI to speed up this drug discovery process by creating new molecules using generative AI. And I think that, there's even just a lot of off-the-shelf software. So I think in silico medicine, they have an actual tool that you can actually pay for a license and even just use their off-the-shelf software to basically give you new molecules that may actually, serve the purposes that you need, or basically will bind to the proteins that you want or have similar effects to the drugs that you already are developing. So I think that there's a lot of potential here. And I think that on top of all of this, we should really be thinking about how to combine these generative models with the models that we're already using outside of generative AI.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Great examples. And before we move over to Neil, I just wanted to also ask you, especially because you're working in biosciences and with patients, like just how your institute is just thinking about responsible AI, or if that's something that's sort of a factor when you approach your research.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack than Jing, just because I don't want to, say the exact same thing, because all of her points were amazing. But I think that there's a lot of concern about IP, especially at our research institute. And that's just because, the AI is trained on a lot of data. So if we're training an AI and it's trained on our data, at what point, if we, for instance, were to let somebody use our AI, are they having access to our data? So that's, one concern. So, I mean, are we using AI responsibly if we're allowing somebody to use our AI that's trained on our data? Another point would be, you need to, just because you've generated something, it doesn't mean that you need to ignore validation. Just because we have all of these great new tools doesn't mean that you can ignore the bench. I think that we can't lose sight of the fact that just because we're more efficient and we have better hypotheses, we still need to have rigorous, wet lab research to back up all of these, new hypotheses.
Right.
And those are, the big ones that I think we need to keep in mind.
Great. Thank you, Travis. So Neil, I'm going to turn over to you, in a way, kind of bringing it up a level to think about the whole R&D ecosystem, research ecosystem, and just thinking about kind of this enormous opportunity to accelerate science. What are your thoughts on the role, and we talked about this earlier this week, the role of industry, where industry is clearly investing heavily in building these large foundational models and investing heavily in compute infrastructure. And we spent some time this week talking to the US government around a national AI research resource to help support the academic community. So I just wanted to see, just give us a perspective on your thoughts of the roles of industry and the roles of government and academia when it comes to advancing Gen AI for research.
Yeah, this is such an interesting topic, and it was fun hearing what the government had to say earlier this week, as you said. So let me, maybe before I say sort of what these folks are doing, let me say what I think they should be doing. Because I think a real question here is if you think about the changing mix. So it's empirically true that industry is doing way more work in AI than government is. They're spending way more money in it, and the question is like, well, how should we think about that? Is that a bad thing or is it a good thing? And I think here we should say, if industry can spend money to improve our products and services in a way that is responsible and makes them better, fantastic, right? That's really great. I think full speed ahead in making our lives better that way. That's great. But I think we shouldn't think of that as encompassing all of the needs of society. There are a whole bunch of things that academia should be doing because market incentives don't provide that. Right, so classically, basic research falls into this category where typically you invest in something and the returns don't come for, could easily be a decade or two. That's too long a window for industry. We want academic scientists doing that. If you have applied research, but it's one that doesn't have a lot of incentive, right? So, for example, neglected diseases is often an example of this. You want academics to be doing that, and even more so as some of these generative AI models get really big, you want someone auditing and making sure that the way that the industry ones are working is in line with what society in general would want. And so those are all really, really important roles that academia should be playing as these models get big. Now, I think there is also a good argument that says they should be training at least some big models themselves so that they have sort of, rival models or alternate approaches to things. But I think in all of these cases, you'd say, there's an important role that academia has to be playing in addition to, industry should be going full speed ahead on being able to do a lot for us.
Right.
I think the challenge here is that if you actually get to what's really happening in the world, you have massive investments going on in industry, and we're not even of roughly the same scale in academia, right? So to put this into perspective, Mark Zuckerberg back in January made an announcement that the purchase of GPUs that Meta was doing this year is going to be larger than the entire NSF budget, right? And so you're saying, okay, well, that's if you think computing power is an important piece of what scientists are doing, and our research really shows it is, that's a real challenge for making sure that scientists have this ability to do that. And I think one of the really heartbreaking things that you do see in that right now is you see sometimes academic scientists who are really very committed to the public goals, enjoy being at universities. Some of them are leaving for industry because they cannot get the resources they need to do the science they want to do in academia. And I think that's a really big gap that needs to be filled.
Yeah, no, that's a really important gap, because we need public research, and we need academia, and we need faculty and students working on really, I mean, like you said, there's some basic research, there's some neglected areas that maybe industry isn't incented to work on. There's some large global problems like climate change. All of these things are incredibly important. So my next question for you is around, the role of partnerships. So I think, we obviously saw, the government and the National AI Research Resources, one mechanism for the government to help fund resources for academia. Any other areas where you really see an important role for partnerships, like this public-private partnerships?
Yeah, so I think, I think there are a couple of different areas, right? So the one that you highlighted, which of course Microsoft has been very generous in, is as part of this national AI resource, contributing a bunch of computation that academia doesn't have yet as part of the pilot. I think that's a really nice start for these things. I think much more generally in some of the other research that we've done, one of the things we did is we analyzed, we said, well, when people are publishing papers and they're using AI, how often do you see that there's an acknowledgement at the bottom that says something like, we want to thank OpenAI for providing the compute, or we want to thank Microsoft for providing the compute for this. And it's amazing how often the big models that people are training, even in academia, have a term like that in the thank you. You similarly see a real rise in the number of hybrid authorships where you have an academic author and a industry author. Often it seems in part to get access to the resources that industry has. So I think those are all really good examples of the partnerships we have. But I also would say I think there's a limit here, right? I think we also need government to step up. I would argue that number should probably be in the billions per year in terms of investing in this hardware so that academic scientists have access to more computing power. Because as I mentioned at the start, that extra bit of computing power is something that has a lot of advantage right now when you'll be able to use deep learning as a technique. And that means that this is a way to make our scientists more productive, and that's just an incredibly valuable thing for society.
So it's important for government to continue to invest in infrastructure, or I should say even step it up, because things are moving fast and generative AI requires those resources, the compute and the data to develop for science. All right. Go ahead.
I was going to say absolutely, and I think a nice example of this is we have seen historically on the supercomputing side that particularly the Department of Energy has been willing to build some very big supercomputers to do big science, right? And I just think that we need to say it was a pretty narrow set of researchers who wanted to use those resources, and I think what we're now going to get is a much broader need for it, and that's going to require a commensurate increase in the resources available.
That makes sense across every discipline. All right. Well, I'm going to pause here, and I just want to turn it over to our audience and see if there are questions, or if you were holding your questions. Now would be a great time to put your questions in the Q&A on the Zoom Q&A for our panelists. And Helen, are you able to
Sure.
set up any of the ones that we have in the queue?
Sure. Here's a specific question for Jing. Does University of Michigan require training about what data cannot be uploaded into these tools? Is there any way for you to do quality checks to make sure that PHI and PII data is not being put into these systems, especially within light of FERPA and HIPAA?
That's a really, really good question. I think it was on many people's minds when they first saw this UMGPT came out. So let me say this: we don't require training. there are many, options of training available. But for somebody to, sign up or just access UMGPT, there's no training required. In terms of what data is allowed, it's sort of a medium sensitive data. For example, FERPA data is allowed. HIPAA data is not allowed. Okay, so there are guidelines about what types of data you can input and what types you can't. And so I'm just hoping like everybody really sees this before they use it. And I don't know at all if there's any way for us to actually check and stop the people from uploading the sensitive data. I don't think there is. Okay, so that's what I can say for now.
Great, thank you. And yes, please, as you think of these questions, please add them to the Q&A. We have another question from a colleague at CCC. So CCC is the Computing Community Consortium, a committee of CRA, and they're holding a panel on generative AI in scientific research at AAAS. They did in 2024. And one of their panelists talked about how AI can generate new proteins that humans could not have even thought of, either because we are not smart enough or because we don't have the capacity to have access to every data point at the same time. So how do we make these models show their work? And explain to us how we can come up with these answers when it's considered millions of data points at the same time. And how can we check these models work when we aren't capable of processing all the data ourselves? Does anybody want to take that? Lots of questions in there, but good points.
I'll take a stab at it first. So I think that you need to actually like break up the problem into like multiple smaller problems. So I mean, if it's like too complex of a protein, then you might need to actually, so like for instance, if you wanted to look at docking of that protein, then you might have to like split up that protein into two different regions of it. And then you could potentially, look at the docking in those two different regions. If it was too complex to actually look at the whole thing. But I mean, there's not like really a good solution when there is like just generally too much data to actually, process it completely without these like new algorithms. So, I mean, the short answer is it's probably the best way would be, or one of the ways you could do it is to split up the problem into multiple smaller problems.
Interesting and good point. Going along, they're coming in, so I'm going to keep going, but feel free if someone else wants to jump in, please do. So another question, this is from Ben Zorn. He is one of the CRA industry co-chairs. He asks, what is the panel's feeling about using GenAI in the research review process? For example, supporting academic reviewers in the process of reviewing paper submissions. Does anybody have any thoughts on that or experience with that?
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so because we actually have been developing such guidelines for our own researchers at University of Michigan. Also, if you see some of the funding agencies like NIH and NSF, they have very clearly prohibited using AI to review grant proposals. And I think for paper submission, it's pretty much the same because really because of two major reasons. One is, the grant proposals and manuscripts, right? They should be reviewed confidentially, right? So that's one big reason against using generative AI. And then the second thing is you are invited to be a reviewer because the journal or the funding agency value your expertise. So they usually don't want you to outsource this to something else that they don't know. So I think for these two major reasons, you probably should not try to do that.
Thanks, Jing.
Great.
Helen, I'm gonna ask one of the questions in the queue and direct it towards Neil. I'm just seeing the question from Jeff Waltz here. There's been a bunch of papers and articles about innovation slowing down in the last couple of years. And I'm not sure if you're thinking innovation globally or just innovation in the United States. But is it too early to tell if generative AI will turn this around or has turned this around? Neil, any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I guess let me maybe give a little context for those who don't know. So economists, one of the things economists care the most about is productivity improvements, which is, think about this as like, if I give you some number of inputs, so some number of people and some amount of equipment, how much how much output do you get? And a productivity improvement means I give you the same number of inputs and you get more output, right? And so this might be like, famous example is in like the sewing industry where they used to, cut pieces in a certain way, and then they got computers to do automated design, and they realized they could actually get a whole bunch more out of each thing by just changing the orientation on the fabric. And so they just got more clothing for the same amount of fabric, right? So that would be a nice productivity increase. So if you look historically in the United States, particularly, you see that up until about 2005, productivity growth was going quite rapidly. And since then, it's really faltered. And the thought here, and a very nice paper by, for example, amongst others, Nicholas Bloom, arguing that ideas are getting harder to find. And it's this idea that you have to invest more and more to find ideas because like the easy ideas, we've gotten them, right? And so now you have to have better tools and do more people and more specialists and all these things in order to get more. And that as that resource requirement for doing science gets larger and larger, it slows things down. So that's the argument. And let's say the productivity slowdown is very supportive of this. So I think to the question specifically, I think it is too early to know whether this is going to accelerate it. But I think we do have hints that suggest it should. So for example, in some of the work that we did, we actually looked at this effect of, okay, well, what happens when you take scientists and you give them AI-enabled tools, right? And are they able to better leverage computation than they were before? And the answer is a lot better. And so another, a nice way to think about this is on a standard NSF project, about 85, 90% of your budget is going to people and about 10 or 15% is going to equipment. If you talk about in these areas where people are using AI to advance stuff, it might be more like 2/3 people, 1/3 equipment. And what that means is that there's a lot of scope to increase the amount of, in this case, computers, right, that scientists are going to use. And then we should expect all of those increases to make them more productive. And so I think there's a good reason for believing that AI will, in fact, make scientists more productive. But for that to actually show up in the overall numbers, it really needs to diffuse quite broadly. And of course, science takes a while, but even if the field of the frontier of science improves quite quickly, it takes a while for that to diffuse out into society and be adopted by industry and experience. So it's going to take a little while before we know for sure.
All right, great answer. So we have potential to increase innovation and grow the economy. Okay, I think we have time for one last question and then we'll close out. This question comes from Theo Drain. I've seen students lacking real-world industrial benchmarks using GenAI to generate a large number of test cases from small academic test cases. This ease of creation is causing a serious quantity over quality concern and risks model collapse. Are you seeing any best practices around this? And I don't know, maybe Travis or Vijay, I don't know if you want to jump in here.
I think that we're still working out how to best handle this. But I mean, there's we've been augmenting data sets for a long time, especially in the imaging field. So I mean, there has been some of that being done already, but I think just from a medical standpoint, I think that there just needs to be standards in place. So for instance, like if you submit, I know that this is a little bit different in industry, but if you were to submit a paper, to a journal and I'm a reviewer, and you augmented 90% of the data set, then there should be some standards in place. Like, I'm probably not going to accept that your model performance is valid based on, the high proportion of your training or testing data being generated from generative AI. I mean, that's what I would say is, we should have standards set in place as a community to kind of safeguard against this.
Excellent. Thank you. Vijay, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think Travis got it. I mean, we need to have a clear standard, and that standard will be need to be set by the community experts. And for example, in materials, we need to come up as a material scientist, and we need to establish the standards. It has to happen, and I hope it will happen soon. Then later, yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Travis. So we're going to close out our audience Q&A, and I think I'll just wrap up with one last question, very rapid fire for each of you. And each of you just, in 1 minute or less, thinking about just young researchers, PhD students today, early career researchers, like what would you tell them? How should they be preparing for a career in research? If you had to give them one piece of advice, what would it be? So, Neil, I'll start with you.
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I'm going to pass on some wisdom from Hal Varian, a very, very notable economist, who said, when you see something, falling, like the cost of doing these kind of predictions are falling, what you want to do is you want to become an expert in something that is complementary to that, right? So if you're like, oh, we can do all these great protein predictions, then you want to go on some area that is like next to that can use better proteins and can take advantage of it. And so I think we have people on the call like that today, right? But I think it's that idea of find something where like it has been restricted by lack of computation. So we heard about material science and biology. I think those are both really great areas for this. But think of those kind of places and think, okay, how do I do that and do it in a way such that what I'm learning is how to leverage this tool that is getting better incredibly fast. And then I get to use that better hammer each year to do really cool things.
Great advice. Okay, Vijay, over to you.
I think I'm going to follow on what Neil said. Adaptability is so critical going to be for new researchers coming into the field, because in earlier generations, people just focus on one particular field, spend 30, 40 years and retire. There's still a lot more to do. But with the generative AI coming in, that's going to change a lot. So if you are going to keep your research focus in a very small region, that could change very quickly and very abruptly. So consider how the AI evolves, and then you need to be very adaptive to your thinking as well as your research focus.
Yep, stay agile and be adaptable. Okay, Jing.
All right, so in addition to staying agile and adaptable, I also want to mention something that I learned from my postdoctoral mentor, Bill Newsom at Stanford University. He used to say this so much, and I felt like I always associate this statement with him, which is, well, think about today or tomorrow, what is the real contribution that you can make to science? So I think, well, what I want to say is that the tools evolve very quickly. You can jump in a lot of new fields. You can pick up a lot of new tools. But in the end, don't be mindless about, while you're doing this, think about, keep in mind what you really want to contribute to science and what is the rigor that you want to uphold. And all the other tools should support these.
Excellent. Be mindful of where you want to make a difference and contribute to science. All right, Travis, last but not least.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I would I would just say, as it relates to generative AI, I would say use generative AI, but I would definitely not completely rely on generative AI. If just to put it simply, like you should still know what you're doing when you're doing it. You should still be an expert in whatever your field is. Because I've seen some inklings, especially in some like students where they're kind of just putting something into a generative AI, and then I see the result, and you should still know what you're doing, but you should definitely be using it as a tool.
Perfect. Well, a great way to wrap up this session. This was an excellent session, and I really appreciate each of the four of you bringing really different perspectives from different fields and from different institutions in ways of looking at things. So thank you so much for your time and for the fantastic discussion today. And thank you for all of you in the audience for joining us. And thank you to our hosts, CRA, industry, and to Helen and Devesh and Tammy for all of your support in organizing this session. Devesh or Helen, any closing words? Anything I've forgotten?
I don't know if we have time for this, Elizabeth, but one of the things we had thought about was to close it out was to ask each of the panelists for their favorite Gen AI hallucination.
Yes, if you've got any in our remaining minute or two, that is a great question. If you do have any favorite hallucinations, we'd love to end on a fun note. If anyone wants to volunteer.
I can go first. I have a lot, but I'll tell you this. At the beginning of at the beginning of GenAI, ChatGPT, I heard from my friends that ChatGPT would think 27 is a prime number, and many people asked it the same question, and they says 27 is a prime number. So one day I asked ChatGPT, I said, I heard that you made a mistake a while ago and thinking 27 is a prime number. And they said, yes, sorry, I made a mistake. So I said, why is 27 not a prime number? And he said, well, it can be divided by 3. I said, great. Then is 21 a prime number? And ChatGPT said, yes, it is. So it's not learning.
Thank you, Jake. Travis.
I don't have a hallucination per se, but I was trying to outsmart ChatGPT one day, and I started asking it to like implement just a simple like feed forward neural network in antiquated programming languages. And so I went from like, Python, and then eventually like C++, and I got to like Fortran eventually. And eventually it was just like, it couldn't figure something out, and it just wrote like pseudocode, and it was like, you need to find another language to do this section. So I thought that was kind of funny. So it gave me an answer, but it was like, you need to find another language.
So mine is sort of I'm not sure it's quite a hallucination, but it's a little bit like that. So I was using ChatGPT to try and create an image for this is for a classroom, and I just was like, I wanted to show how you could create very fanciful images very quickly, right? And the power of generative AI. And so I said, okay, well, generate a picture of a professor talking to students, but the classroom is upside down. The professor is standing on the ceiling, and all the students are on the ceiling. And it produced like a just standard classroom, but it was just that the professor was standing on the desk, and then it very confidently declared underneath it, here is an example of an upside down classroom where the people are standing on the ceiling, and it just, it just had no correspondence to the picture. And I tried a whole bunch of different prompts, and I just could not get it to figure out to do the rotation.
So that does sound like a hallucination of some kind, Neil. So, Vijay?
Okay, so in one of our projects, we're trying to find a new material. we defined all the properties and said the cost has to be very small. It should be earth abundant material, blah, blah. And then we give all the things, and then it gave a bunch of material. The first one was sodium chloride, table salt. I was like, okay, we need to look at it. What is it? We can do definitely better than sodium chloride. So and we go back and we fixed it, but that's stuck in my mind.
Thank you, Vijay. And last but not least, Elizabeth, do you want to tell us your favorite ChatGPT story or hallucination?
I don't have a favorite that I can think of. I've tried all kinds of image generation things that come out incredibly not what I intended. I think that's probably my biggest challenge. I tried to get it to do 5 gears the other day, and that did not come out. But yes. Devesh, do you have any you want to share?
There are lots of them, but not for polite company here. So
That's funny. Okay, we'll have to hear those later.
So Elizabeth, do you want to close out? I think.
Absolutely. We are on the mark. 4:30. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. Jing, Travis, Neil, Vijay, really appreciate your perspectives, and Helen and Devesh and Tammy for organizing this. So thank you very much. Exciting times ahead.